In a world where everything seems accessible, it makes sense to also believe that everything is preventable. Everything can be helped. But in the decades past, that didn't seem as likely. We didn't have the thoughts and ideas at our fingertips, or even the ability to call for help. If you became trapped, you would be there until someone noticed you were missing. If you became trapped, you would be there until someone was able to locate you. If you became trapped, you would be stuck there until you could be set free. For one man, that freedom came in the agonizing depths of a cave, alone, in the dark, and smothered with a rock. His death would result in an impact that would lead to the preservation of the most dynamic cave system in the world. Welcome back to Tragedy with a View. I am your host, Kayla, and welcome back to a free solo episode where I venture off on my own without a co-host. Thank you for being here. I'm going to do my twice a year ask that if you enjoy this podcast, please leave a rating or review. No matter where you listen, it really means so much to me. And in combination with that, if you could share your favorite episode with one person, that would also go a long way to continuing to help us grow. And with that growth comes the opportunity to earn a bit more, and I'd like to take this as an opportunity to announce that we do have a small amount that we will be donating to a charity of listeners' choosing. Probably starting in November, you'll be able to vote on our Patreon page and our Instagram page, so be sure to join us on either of those platforms. You don't have to be a paying member on Patreon. You can join the free membership, but just as a reminder with that, your money does go to good at the end of the year, and I'm really thankful that you've helped me to accomplish this. Suggestions and voting for nonprofits will begin in November so that we can get the money where it needs to go before December is over. And I do have a list of nonprofits that I am going to share, but it's not going to be solely that list. If you have any suggestions, I'm going to give you an opportunity to give a suggestion. If there's a charity or a nonprofit that's close to your heart, they will all be in the selection. So today we are going to Mammoth Cave, named for its size and nothing to do with the extinct prehistoric animal. The park was established as a national park on July 1st, 1941, after many eminent domain proceedings. The park was named a World Heritage Site in 1981, an International Biosphere Reserve in 1990, and further, it has been named an International Dark Sky Park in 2021. Mammoth Cave formed due to a process called solution cave formation, and this is caused by rainwater absorbing carbon dioxide as it passes through the air and then the ground and forms a acid. This acidic water then passes through the cracks in the limestone that is beneath the ground surface in Kentucky, and as more and more water collects in these cracks and these hollowed out areas, it dissolves the limestone eventually over millions of years, creating the massive cave system we see today. Further, there are new discoveries being made in mammoth caves all of the time, such as in February of this year, 2024, a part of a jaw and gills from a Glycmanius, which is an extinct shark which lived 300 million years ago, was found in the caves. This is a really unique find because the dating of this actually pushed the existence back to 50 million years earlier than originally thought. Mammoth Caves National Park is one of the more unique places in the world, comprising of over 420 miles or 675 kilometers of known underground passages. It's no surprise that many reports of paranormal activity have been reported over the years. Currently, there are over 150 reports, with many coming from the park rangers who lead tours through the caves. So many that 2 rangers would go on to write a book compiling stories of some of the more common spirits of the park. In the early 1900s, there were so many different caves being discovered in this area that it would become known as Cave City. And with this abundance of caves came tourists, which also brought unethical competition, which became the Cave Wars. The Cave Wars essentially revolved around the fact that cave exploration and tours were a lucrative business venture and everyone wanted in on it. Different people owned different segments of the caves, all of which had their own entrances and many of which were connected but hadn't been fully explored yet. As owners tried to battle each other for tourist dollars, a war of sorts erupted. Mammoth Cave was a name already established, and it was also well known and easy for visitors to have a conversation about. Rival cave owners would hire people to line the streets with signs in an attempt to pull the attention away from Mammoth Cave, as well as any others, and bring the focus to their own cave tours. But it didn't stop with simple advertisement. Suddenly, workers were impersonating other cave tour guides or policemen, stating that the caves were closed when tourists came. Others would harass guides while they were working to give the impression that the caves that the tourists were heading to was not safe or it wasn't as good as another cave. And then more violently, others would burn down the ticket booths so that way they couldn't purchase tickets. Then there was even a legal case called Edwards versus Sims, where Edwards had discovered a cave entrance on his property. This cave then traveled below the boundary line and crossed into the neighboring property owned by Sims. Sims could not access the cave that ran beneath his property due to the entrance being on Edwards' land, so Sims sued Edwards for trespassing. This case drug out for years, but ultimately it was ruled that when you own the land, you own what is beneath the surface layers as well as extending up into the sky. Therefore, even though the entrance was on Edwards' land, the length of the cave that was beneath the surface and past the property line was Sims, and Edwards was trespassing. Mammoth Caves has a significant number of caves, and as they were originally owned by individuals, eventually they were purchased and compiled into what we know as Mammoth Caves National Park today. Some of these caves included, of course, Mammoth Cave, Diamond Cave, Salt's Cave, and Sand Cave. According to the National Guard, inside Sand Cave is a subterranean coliseum which stands 80 feet tall, and particles of gold have been rumored to be found in the cave as well. The cave was very difficult to maneuver through and would require someone who wasn't claustrophobic and had experience in tight passages. Today, the cave itself is closed, but walking along the trail to the entrance will give you an overview of the history that we are going to deep dive on today. Near Sand Cave, there are, of course, other caves and entrances, and one day a tour guide by the name of Colleen Olson was exploring parts of the cave system near Sand Cave. In 1992, Colleen moved to Kentucky from Washington State and started her what would become a 25-year-long career as a ranger in Mammoth Caves. Colleen was exploring with her friend Richard when they finally came to the entrance of Sand Cave. As you may have already picked up on, Sand Cave itself doesn't have a ton of walking room except for at the entrance. This is because in 1925, the cave was sealed off for public safety reasons. So Colleen and Richard are in the entrance when the toe of her boot catches on some rocks and she trips, falling forward. As she falls, Colleen reaches out her hands to help break the fall when she is grabbed by the back of her shirt and yanked back upright. Not thinking much of this, Colleen turns to Richard to thank him for his quick reaction. Only when she turns and finally sees him, he's all the way on the other side of the entrance, meaning he could not have been the one to grab her and prevent her from falling. But knowing this cave's history, instead, Colleen thanks Floyd. Floyd Collins, whose real name was William Floyd Collins, was born on June 20th, 1887 to Lee and Martha Jane Collins of Logan County, Kentucky. From a very early age, Floyd loved to explore the caves he came across on his family farm. Once he hit the age of 6 and on, his parents knew that if they couldn't find him, that he was probably in a cave. In 1917, Floyd would end up discovering a new cave on his family's property. This cave was given the name Crystal Cave and ran beneath his father's land. With this, Floyd entered into the cave wars, but he didn't have much to account for. To get to Crystal Cave, you had to travel down the long Flint Ridge Road, which held several other cave entrances. Many visitors would be enticed by these other caves, which promised the same captivating experience as the others, and very few would make it to Crystal Cave, meaning that Floyd never turned a profit. But Floyd then had another idea. He discovered that a property adjacent to his family's was owned by Beasley Doyle, and it had a cave entrance on it as well. This property was situated next to Cave City Road and would have to be passed in order to get to the famous Mammoth Cave. This appeared to be prime territory that not many people knew about and was, according to Floyd, free for the taking. He would just have to convince Beasley to agree to a business deal. Floyd approached Beasley, and they soon entered an agreement that Floyd could explore the cave, and if it was deemed worthy, they would split the profits of the cave tours. This cave was dubbed Sand Cave. On July 30th, 1925, Floyd entered Sand Cave, and as this was his initial or first exploration of the cave, he only brought a kerosene lantern with him. He decided to go in during the morning hours so that depending on how long his lantern would last, he would have the entire day to explore. But he quickly found that he had to force himself through some pretty narrow passages. At one point, he had to lay down on his belly and inch himself through a passageway with one arm down to his side and the other arm stretched overhead as he gently pushed the lantern ahead of him. Once he got through this section, the cave opened up into the grand and beautiful room that was roughly 80 feet or 24 meters high. The grand idea of finding a way to hollow out the narrow passage so that tourists could walk through began to take shape when the lantern flickered. When Floyd checked the kerosene level, he found it almost empty. Knowing he was low on time and not wanting to get stuck in a cave he didn't know without any light, he decided to head back. So onto his belly he goes, and as he is squeezing back through this passage, he loses grip on the lantern for a moment. As he wiggled to the side so he could reach back and grab it, his foot bumps into what you would assume is solid rock. It was actually a 27-ton boulder, which is roughly 60,000 pounds or 28,000 kilograms. This boulder shifted, pinned his left ankle down, and successfully trapped him in place. He had little room to maneuver since this was the location where he moved inch by inch, and no matter what Floyd did, he couldn't get his ankle loose. Struggling more, a sudden but slight collapse of stone above him occurred. Debris buried his legs, though it seemed to be a little bit on the looser side as he could still shift about. But then his lantern went out. On January 31st, when Floyd's neighbors noticed that he hadn't returned home the night before, they decided to go looking for him. When Joel Estes, the 17-year-old son of the neighbor, found Floyd's coat hanging on a rock outside of Sand Cave, they correctly assumed that's where he would be. Joel crawls into the cave and finds Floyd alive, 60 feet or 18 meters beneath the surface, and then retreats to let his family know, who then contact Floyd's brothers, Homer and Marshall. Once Homer and Marshall hear about Floyd, they bring food and water into the cave for Floyd so that way he can, eat and be kept alive while they figure out what to do. At this point, no one was willing to crawl into the tight space to try to free Floyd from the boulder that had already collapsed down. On February 1st, Homer was the first to really try to do something, and he crawled back as far as he could in the cave to attempt to dig Floyd free. He was unsuccessful inside of the cave, but outside of the cave, things were starting to happen. Locals were gathering, trying to figure out how to help, and many were hopeful that they would witness Floyd coming out of the cave. Marshall offered up $500 to whoever could free his brother, but no one came forward. For reference, $500 in 1925 is equivalent to nearly $10,000 in 2024. The rescue efforts were not being led by one specific person, and therefore anyone who did try to help received mixed messages and found the efforts to be really disjointed. Still, people showed up with food and water and offered to take it in to Floyd, but once inside the cave, they would find it too nerve-wracking as it was much tighter and darker than they thought. Many of these volunteers would then stash the food in cracks and bail before they ever got to Floyd. Further, they didn't communicate this to anyone. On February 2nd, the fourth day, Floyd is clearly declining. He isn't able to keep warm, he's shaking, and parts of his legs have gone numb. His mental state is swaying from bouts of extreme stupor to being completely aware of what is happening and maybe even overly aware and a bit panicky. As word spreads above ground, a journalist from the Louisville Courier-Journal by the name of William Miller, also known as Skeets, decided to take on the story. When he arrived to the cave, he initially talks to Homer and starts asking him questions, and Homer, who was likely fed up at people being nosy and not actually helping Floyd, points at the entrance of the cave, and he tells Skeets that if he wants to know what's going on, he's going to have to crawl inside the cave and find out for himself. Skeets is a small-statured man, which is part of the reason he got his nickname. Short for mosquito, Skeets also had a habit of not leaving things alone, which made him a reliable reporter. Once inside the cave, Skeets sees the condition that Floyd is in, and instead of interviewing him right away, he takes some time to talk to Floyd like a human being, bringing him food and water and trying to find a way to free Floyd. This same day, Lieutenant Robert Burden from the Special Police and Fire Rescue Team arrives and decides the best course of action is to just pull Floyd out. Using a harness around Floyd's chest, this extremely painful attempt is unsuccessful. Also arriving on this day is Floyd's caving friend, John Gerald, who also climbs in to be with Floyd and attempts to dig Floyd out again. By this point, nearly 200 people are outside of the cave for observation purposes, not to help rescue, and 2 vendors have arrived. One sells hot coffee and snacks, and the other offers first aid. On February 3rd, day 5, Floyd's story becomes the top news story on a national level. In an attempt to help, 3 men from Woodson and Craft Monument Company out of Louisville, Kentucky, arrive and offer to essentially chip away at the rock where it is trapping Floyd's ankle. At this point, Floyd's friend John had kind of taken over the rescue process, and when they presented John with their idea, John was extremely concerned that the impact from chipping away at this rock would cause things to shift more and potentially collapse, and refused to let them try. Remember, Floyd's foot knocking into the boulder was what caused it to shift, so it is completely understandable that John would reason that tools would cause things to shift as well. But this decision rippled through the people there, trying to help, and divided them between people willing to take the risk and those who were unwilling. But John had some other ideas that he hadn't been able to work on yet. This day is also the first that a rescue shaft is brought up. This idea is brought forward by the superintendent of the Kentucky Rock Asphalt Company. Hang with me on his name, which is Henry St. George Tucker Carmichael. Carmichael, who was the superintendent of this company, was an educated and trained engineer. As Carmichael discussed the options and location with Floyd's brothers, both Homer and Marshall feared that the digging of the shaft would impact the ground too much and it would cause a collapse, much like John feared with chiseling the rock away. But they do put the men to work clearing away rocks at the entrance of the cave so that access to the channel Floyd is stuck in becomes easier. They also have some volunteers go in to help remove the rubble from Floyd's legs, and this process goes relatively smooth. Skeets and some other volunteers then offer to run basically an extension cord from a 32-volt generator connected to some light bulbs all the way into the cave to where Floyd is, so that way he can at least have some light, and this would also provide him with a source of warmth. On this day, the National Guard also shows up, but not to assist with the rescue, but to manage the crowd of people now hovering outside of the cave. And then when Lieutenant Burden returns, this time insisting to pull Floyd out, even if that means they have to remove his foot to do so, he and John get in a huge fight over this. John has already set into motion the idea of using jacks to try to prop up the boulder that is trapping Floyd's ankle, but they quickly figure out that 2 of the jacks are just too large to wedge into this tiny space, and the smallest jack that they have is actually too small. Every time they try to use wooden blocks to prop it up, the blocks will slip out, making the jack useless. Skeets was the one who was working with the jacks, and he was continuously visiting Floyd throughout these days. And as Skeets is working on trying to get these jacks to work, Floyd can see that he's getting more and more frustrated. Floyd finally convinces him to take a break and come back the next day, and they'll try again. During these times that Skeets was visiting with Floyd, he would intermittently do interviews with Floyd as well, which were then sent out to the rest of the country and soon the world. Despite everything going on and all of the failed attempts and plans that have not come to fruition, Floyd is in positive spirits on February 4th. However, it is on this day that John starts to notice signs of the cave ceiling not handling the amount of people coming and going from the cave well. All the people results in, of course, friction from the bodies passing against the rocks, but also body heat, adding heat and moisture to the cave, all of which combines to lead to a rapid deterioration and a high chance of collapse. Despite the fact that John has significantly more cave experience than Skeets and Lieutenant Burden, they both try to pacify John and assure him that nothing bad is going to happen and they just need to continue with what they're doing. But by 4 a.m., 2 volunteers who had entered Sand Cave to provide Floyd with some food noticed that the ceiling has a large crack in it. And even more concerning, that there are large rocks and debris that appear to be trying to come through those cracks. They quickly deliver the food to Floyd and then leave the cave, and as they are exiting, the crack opens and rocks fall through. This collapse of the ceiling effectively creates a barrier between all of the rescue teams, all of the volunteers, and Floyd, who is now alone with very little food, very little water, and no way out. John and some other volunteers try to start digging through the rubble, and as they go, they try to prop up the sides of the cave walls and give some support to the new ceiling. But due to the already weak walls of the cave with several days of rain, the structure is just too compromised, and a second collapse occurs. This time, John gets caught up in it, and while he is overall okay, they realize how dangerous this idea is. It is decided after this that the passageway from the entrance of the cave is just simply too dangerous. There's no way that they will be able to get to Floyd or get Floyd out from this route. Finally, on the sixth day, February 5th, the governor of Kentucky at the time, William Fields, organizes a rescue crew, placing a general from the National Guard, Henry Denhart, in charge. In coordination with this, the engineer Carmichael creates a plan for a 6x6 vertical shaft to be dug down to rescue Floyd. General Denhart is pretty much making this rescue the top priority that Kentucky has ever seen. In a press conference, he states that it is now up to you men to drill through the ground directly to Floyd's side. Spare no expense. The purse strings of Kentucky are open. Because there was a large conversation needed about where to place the shaft, it wasn't until 1:30 p.m. that workers actually started on the shaft. Because there was concern about the cave collapsing and killing Floyd, the only tools allowed were picks and shovels. Because of this, many companies from all over the country decided to send supplies to Sand Cave, and the area was not only overrun with people, but now supplies. In addition to this, the group of men selected to work on this shaft was 75 strong, and they would be digging all day, every day until they reached Floyd. The idea would be that teams would work in shifts and switch out about every 45 minutes to an hour so that the work could stay continuous. Carmichael predicted that it would take them 30 hours to reach Floyd, which would mean that they were digging at a rate of 2 feet or 0.6 meters per hour. This was based on how the first 4 or 5 feet went, but they neglected to remember that at first, where the men were digging through mud and muck, there would also come a time where they would have to dig through rocks mixed with that mud and then solid rock. The shaft was only big enough for 3 people to work at a time, but still, by 7 p.m., they had dug down 7 feet or 2.1 meters, but that rate slowed to only 1 foot per hour. After a week of being stuck in the cave, there was nearly 400 cars parked along the road waiting for news about Floyd. Unfortunately, the shaft is progressing slowly and has reached only 17 feet or 5.1 meters. The news and reporters at the site are causing everyone to be on edge. Homer and John continue to argue with the people managing the shaft and are therefore banned from the area. But with this, the media, being unable to get a good response from anyone, begins to spread the word of doubt. Not doubt that they can remove Floyd alive, but doubt that Floyd is in the cave at all. On February 7th, the National Guard is forced to put up barbed wire fence because people refuse to listen to the rules that they can't be in the working area. And with this, others start to look for nearby cave entrances to try to find a back way to Floyd. With the huge media presence, a person from every state, with the exception of Hawaii and Alaska, since they were not yet states, is at the location. By February 8th, everyone is hoping to see Floyd come out of the cave. With 10,000 people arriving, this day was dubbed as Carnival Sunday, which feels just a little bit disrespectful to me that people are coming and celebrating at the location of a man who, to everyone's knowledge, is still stuck inside a very tight passage, 60 feet underground with no food, no water, no one being there with him. They don't know that he's alive, and people are partying. And the fact is, Floyd is absolutely still stuck. The shaft at this point was only 23 feet deep or 7 meters. But as this day rolls into night, people start pointing fingers and placing blame, Lieutenant Burden even states that he believes some of the men who were trying to help are guilty of nothing short of murder. Again, rumors start to circulate saying that this is a publicity stunt to get more people to Crystal Cave and that Floyd isn't in the cave at all. This, unfortunately, becomes such a loud rumor that police are forced to investigate the claim. Others try to start blocking the ability for rescues to continue, and the military has to step in to prevent this. Even so, the shaft seems to be progressing at a snail's pace. Due to the rain and the cold fronts coming in, workers are beginning to tire and slow down. By the 12th of February, Floyd has been trapped for 13 days, and it has been over a week since the cave collapsed, meaning that he's been without food and water for over a week. The shaft now reaches 48 feet or 14.6 meters, and the sides are constantly needing support, as without it, they are also caving in. By 10 p.m. the following night, February 13th, the shaft has only gained another 4 feet, making it a total of 52 feet or 15.8 meters in depth. The following day, February 14th, the shaft only gained another 3 feet, making it 55 feet or 16.7 meters deep, and with the sides of the shaft collapsing, those digging begin to move laterally in an attempt to reach Floyd faster. But the rain doesn't help this situation at all. Heavy rain and natural runoff allowed 2 feet of water to collect in the bottom of the shaft that is regularly being pumped out in an attempt to continue digging. On February 15th, the rescuers are so close to Floyd by this point that word spreads and 5,000 people return to the area to await Floyd being pulled free. But at 1:30 p.m. on February 16th, when they finally break into the cave and find Floyd, he has died. Based on their quick survey, he had been dead for over 24 hours, and from the sinking of his eyes, they know it is from a combination of exposure, dehydration, and starvation. Because his leg was obviously still trapped, they decided to leave his body as to not risk any more lives, and they allowed the shaft to collapse as the last rescuer abandoned. Now, you might be thinking that this is where Floyd's adventure ends, but you would be wrong. In 1927, 2 years later, Crystal Cave and the property which Sand Cave was on were purchased by Dr. Harry Thomas. He intended to use Floyd as a tourist attraction, so he had Floyd's body exhumed and put on display in a glass top coffin. This coffin was then placed in the center of Crystal Cave along with a tombstone that read, "Greatest Cave Explorer Ever Known." On September 23rd, 1927, someone attempted to steal Floyd's body, but they failed. Then on March 18th, 1929, someone was successful in stealing Floyd's body. When police used bloodhounds to track the thief, they found Floyd's body in a field. However, it was missing his left leg. Ironically, this is the same leg that was trapped inside the cave. In 1989, Floyd's body was permanently laid to rest by the National Park System, but his story would go on to inspire multiple books, including Trapped by Robert K. Murray and Roger W. Brucker, and The Life and Death of Floyd Collins, authored by his brother Homer and John L. Lerberger. Additionally, it inspired the musical called Floyd Collins and the 1951 Hollywood film Ace in the Hole. Further, Floyd's endeavor and death brought a huge amount of notice to Mammoth Caves and set the ball rolling for what would ultimately become the preservation of the caves and the establishment of the national park. In addition to this, the interviews that Skeets took with Floyd, which is part of the reason this area got put on the map, would circulate and would earn him the Pulitzer Prize. And that's it for today. Everyone, thank you for listening. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and We'll see you next time. Bye. What is life without close calls with disaster? Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow the podcast to be the first to hear the now weekly episodes. Join our subscription on Patreon, Apple, or Spotify today and immerse yourself in the haunting beauty of the great outdoors. For around $4 a month, you'll get exclusive access to the first episode of each month and early access to all other episodes, showcasing the morbid and mysterious side of nature. Please reach out with story requests, and if you have your own story, please email tragedywithaview@gmail.com for a chance to have your story featured on a later episode. Again, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.